Barman, I ordered a triple gin, tonic, ice, lemon and lime. And I thank you for the delivery of the tonic, ice, lemon and lime, but you appear to have omitted the triple gin. Now, I'd never accuse you of dishonesty. You have a lot of people to serve. Your attention can waver, but if I order a triple gin, tonic, ice, lemon and lime, I think I'm entitled to get a triple gin, ice, lime, tonic and tonic. I think that's a fair point, don't you? I don't think I'm being unreasonable, because as I said before, if I rule the world, every day will be the first day in spring. Every day.
Barry Cryer, ladies and gentlemen. But it's odd, isn't it, that we laugh at the portrayal of someone who's drunk, but we wouldn't laugh at, say, a heroin addict or any other type of addict for that matter. And yet, in terms of the damage it does, alcohol kills 10 times as many young people as heroin or cocaine. And overall, it's been estimated to be responsible for 40,000 deaths every year. And that's roughly the equivalent of 2 jumbo jet crashes every week.
With opening hours in England and Wales only recently extended, the fact is that 3 million people in Britain are drinking more than the recommended safe limits. But while we naturally see the sense of putting other dangerous drugs outside the law, for some reason we actively encourage the use of alcohol. Most of us enjoy a drink, and it's something that a lot of people do every day, openly and quite legally.
So tonight we're going to look at why alcohol has this sinister ability to seduce us into accepting drink as part of our way of life, while apparently ignoring the damage it can do.
Clearly, drinking alcohol can be a pleasant experience. It makes us feel relaxed and sociable, but many people don't realise how easily we're seduced into drinking it. Over the last 2 weeks, we've carried out an experiment to see how the amount of alcohol people get through is affected by the way it's presented to them. What we did was to offer drinks to 2 groups of 30 people before they came into the studio. The same amount of drink was available, but it was presented in 2 different ways. Now, for last week's group, the only alcoholic drinks already poured out were on the far right-hand side of the table, in front of the camera and furthest from the door. All the other drinks on that table and the other tables in the room were soft drinks. Well, now, last week's group as a whole consumed 8 cans of lager and 12 glasses of wine. On the other hand, for this week's group, the situation was reversed. This time, the soft drinks were on the far right-hand side of the table, nearest the camera, and all the other drinks on the show were, in fact, alcoholic. They were either beer or wine. Now, the question I want to ask you all is, how much more do you think that this week's group drank than last week's group? I mean, do you think, hands up those for instance who think it's half as much again, roughly speaking. Okay, double the amount. Yeah, quite a lot of people. Well, in fact, the answer was 3.5 times as much. Boozy lot, boozy lot. They're dreadful. Anyway, so there you are. It all goes to show that how much alcohol we drink has less to do with whether we actually want to drink alcohol, much more to do with its availability. If it's on hand, then we're likely to drink it.
Well, there's obviously something so seductive about alcohol that many people find it hard to resist. So it may come as a surprise to learn that, at least as far as the nervous system is concerned, alcohol is actually a depressant. To understand why, we need to know how nerves transmit their messages normally. Now, what happens is that after a nerve impulse passes along the nerve to the nerve ending, it triggers the release of transmitter molecules. They then jump across the gap. There are some of them going now. They pass across to the next nerve, carrying the message with them. Now, in this case, because this is a stimulatory nerve, and that's one that is designed to make things happen, that message is for the next nerve to fire and carry the message on. But as well as the stimulatory nerves, there are also inhibitory ones, like this blue one, and their job is to prevent things from happening. Their transmitter molecules actually block up the next nerve so that it can't fire. Now, usually, the different level of activity between these 2 types of nerves is balanced so that we're able to function normally. But what alcohol does is to affect the transmitter molecules, whether they're stimulatory or inhibitory, by stopping them, here and here, from carrying that message on to the next nerve, so that all messages find it much harder to get through. Now, this damping down of nerve communication affects not just 2, but millions of nerves when we drink, causing a generalized depression of the nervous system, which makes us less able to do things. The first effect we feel is perhaps a little lightheadedness. Then, with more alcohol, we begin to lose our sense of balance and coordination. And if we keep on drinking, we can eventually drink ourselves unconscious or even to death.
But if alcohol is a depressant affecting all our nerves, particularly those in the brain, why do people apparently become more excitable when they drink? After all, you'd expect a depressant to slow us down. Well, the very first nerves to be affected by alcohol are those blue inhibitory nerves, like these ones here, which put the brakes on our emotions. And normally they're kept in check by the so-called higher centers of the brain, which we've shown in yellow up there. And they send messages via those inhibitory nerves to the area of emotion here, this red bit, telling it not to fire. So that way our emotions are kept in check. But alcohol, as we've already said, stops those inhibitory messages getting through. Now, you see, there are no white transmitter molecules. And with the brakes off, we're likely to become much more emotional. We may become more talkative and excited, or more moody and aggressive. It's difficult to say quite how we're going to react, because it's not just a matter of our underlying personality, but also the situation we're in and how we're feeling at the time. So, alcohol gives us freer rein on our emotions, one reason perhaps for its seductive charm. But that doesn't explain why we keep coming back for more. And no one really knows the answer for certain. But one idea is that alcohol somehow stimulates reward centers that are found in this area of the brain up here. And that makes us feel good. And if that is what happens, then it's not surprising we keep wanting to repeat the experience again and again.
The sinister thing about that way of making ourselves feel good is that it seems to work on us almost without our being consciously aware of it. So it is a form of seduction where we, the victims, don't realize what's happening, particularly as we may not know just how much alcohol we're getting through. After all, it's not that easy to tell. Like any effective seducer, alcohol comes in many different disguises. Now, what we really need, of course, is a scale to compare the alcohol content of one drink with another. Now, perhaps I could ask our two friends from the audience here, Rebecca and Paul, to help me. What I want you to do is to tell me what you think the alcohol content of these drinks is, starting with the one with the least alcohol in it.
The beer nearest me.
Which one?
I think.
The sherry?
This one? The beer nearest me.
That's lager. Right, okay.
Then the white wine.
Then the white wine. Okie doke. Right. What's the next one up from there?
The bitter.
The beer. Right.
Then the red wine, then the sherry.
Yep.
Both agree? Oh, there's a lot of agreement here. Obviously, habitual assessor of alcohol content. There we are.
Brandy and scotch is difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, that's quite tough, isn't it?
Brandy last.
Yeah. Right.
Brandy's the worst. So let's have scotch next. And then the brandy. Yes, I think a lot of people would agree with you there. But in fact, you're wrong. You are wrong. It's a trick. It's a trick, really, because the fact is that they all contain exactly the same amount of alcohol. Of course, there's a difference in terms of the concentration of alcohol, but not the overall amount. I mean, the scotch, for instance, is obviously much more concentrated than the beer. But it's also true that different drinks can affect us in different ways. But again, that's because of the concentration, which may affect the speed at which the alcohol is absorbed through the stomach. But as far as the body is concerned as a whole, it's the amount of alcohol which it has to break down, which is the most important thing. And in this case, it's exactly the same. Each of these glasses contains what's referred to as one standard unit of alcohol.
So, armed with that standard unit, we're now in a position to work out how much alcohol we're actually drinking. And yet, here again, we're up against yet another weapon in alcohol's armory of seduction. It tends to make our memories a bit fuzzy, which prevents us from keeping an accurate count. Now, for instance, if I turn to the audience here, can I ask you, for instance, to instantly recall how many units you drank last week?
No.
You can't recall? How about you? Could you?
Well, I could probably...
Give me a rough guess.
It must have been 20, 30 units.
20 or 30, roughly?
Somewhere between 15 and 25.
Right, 1525. Well, I'm sure that's an honest estimate, but I'm afraid you're probably wrong. Because, unfortunately, the sobering fact is that whatever we say we drink, the chances are that it's an underestimate. If you rely on what people claim they drink, our annual consumption of alcohol turns out to be only half the amount recorded by Customs and Excise. Their annual figures for the sale of all types of alcohol show that, on average, each of us over the age of 15 drinks the equivalent of 243 pints of beer, 12 pints of cider, 112 glasses of wine, and 210 shots of spirits. In other words, a grand total of 832 units each every year.
Well, that's equivalent to 16 units every week. But is that a safe amount to be drinking? Well, the Health Education Authority's recommended safe weekly limits are only 21 units for men and 14 for women. Now, given that 1 in 10 people doesn't drink at all, it's no surprise that, as we mentioned earlier, 3 million drinkers are exceeding those limits. But what if we do top the limit? What's the harm in allowing ourselves to be seduced by alcohol? Ironically, the obvious problem, a hangover, is not in itself too serious. The headache and sickness that we feel is in part related to the dehydration that alcohol causes. But if you top up your water level, then that will correct it fairly quickly. Another cause of the hangover is so-called congeners, and they're the chemicals that give darker drinks like red wine and brandy their colour and flavour. But they're also poisons, which are notorious for aggravating a hangover, and that's why clear drinks like white wine, or even better, vodka, tend to leave you with a clearer head. But congeners are only present in tiny amounts, so the long-term damage they're likely to do is very small. No, the main danger from drinking is the alcohol itself. Now let me give you an idea of just exactly what it can do. These raw eggs contain proteins that are very similar to the ones that we have in our own cells. Now if I pour some water onto one of the eggs, you can see, no big surprise, nothing much happens. But if I add some neat alcohol, just watch. Yeah, pretty revolting. It looks as if I'd begun to cook it. And that's because the protein is being damaged and destroyed in much the same way that it would be by heat. Now this is pure alcohol, which works very quickly, and it would be rapidly fatal if anyone tried to drink it. But the effect of drinking alcohol in a more diluted form is just the same. The only difference is that it takes rather longer to do its damage.
And here's a good example of the sort of damage that can happen given sufficient exposure to alcohol. Now, the most commonly affected organ is the liver, because that's where about 80% of the alcohol that we drink is chemically broken down. And this is a normal, healthy liver, and you can see, in fact, that it's smooth, it's pinkish, and it's really quite soft. Now, contrast that with this liver here, which has been badly damaged by drink. In fact, it's got cirrhosis of the liver. And you can see that it's smaller, it's a sort of pale greeny colour, it's hard, and it's really quite rough. Now, if we look at the normal liver under the microscope, you'll see there a nice regular pattern of cells surrounding a central vein. But compare that with a picture of the cirrhotic liver, and you can see that the regular pattern has been completely destroyed, and there's just a sort of swathe of fibrous tissue, scar tissue really, and in fact there's very little functioning liver tissue left.
So that's the effect of alcohol abuse on the liver. And it's worse for women because our livers are more vulnerable to alcohol damage. Now, nobody's really sure why, but it may be something to do with our hormones. But damage to the liver is, I'm afraid, only the tip of the iceberg. If we work from the top of the body downwards, alcohol can cause damage to the brain, with memory loss and psychiatric problems, as well as strokes and damage to the nerves. It can cause inflammation of the throat and gullet, which can lead on to cancer, particularly in smokers. Alcohol can lead to high blood pressure and may directly damage the muscle of the heart, as it can ordinary muscle. It causes inflammation of the stomach and small intestine, with the risk of developing a peptic ulcer. Alcohol can also damage the pancreas, leading to diabetes and problems with the absorption of food. It can permanently reduce the size of the male sex organs and can cut sperm count enough to cause infertility. And alcohol may also reduce a woman's fertility, as well as increasing the risk of miscarriage or of damage to her unborn child. In fact, there's hardly a part of our bodies, on the inside at least, that isn't affected by alcohol. But you're not likely to find out about the damage until it's too late.
Unfortunately, even if we keep within the recommended limits, we still have to take care. Alcohol can still be lethal. As we've said, alcohol is a depressant and it affects all our nerves. Even in small amounts, it can make us less able to concentrate, it can impair our sense of judgment, and it can begin to affect our control of balance and coordination. And here to help me show you what I mean is Perry Rawlinson. Hello, Perry. Now, you're an expert on this particular driving machine. How come you're so good on it?
Well, my dad owns an arcade, so I tend to get a lot of practice.
Good. Well, earlier on, Perry proved how good he was. To get a high score here, you have to drive as fast as you can with the minimum of accidents. And he knocked up an average score of 6 million points, which is good. It's very good, in fact. I tried it myself, and I was quite pleased to get 350. So, that's our starting point. But how would his score be affected by drinking alcohol? Now, to find out, half an hour ago, we gave Perry 2 double vodka and tonics. Now, Perry, you are 18, but how are you feeling now?
Great.
Great. Good. Well, off you go, and let's see how you get on with the driving game. Now, in the inset picture, you can see Perry this afternoon, before he had a drink, and you can compare that with the way that he's driving now. Well, that's pretty fast and furious, but down to 3.5 million there from 6 and a couple of nasty smashes on the way. Let's see after that what your blood alcohol level is. Just check that's working. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to breathe into there, good hard blow. Okay. And while we wait for those figures to come up, why do you think your score was not so good when you tried just now?
Well, the game felt a lot more difficult, and I felt I had to concentrate a lot more, whereas when I didn't have the drink before, I could get easily turn the corners and stuff like that. But my judgment was totally off.
You felt less in control, did you?
Yeah.
Well, let's see what the breathalyzer here has registered, and we've got 70 milligrams per 100 millilitres. Now, in fact, that is just below the legal limit of 80, but how would you feel about driving the way you're feeling at the moment?
Well, I'm only just now learning how to drive, but the way I feel now, I don't think I'll try and drive a car now. No.
You wouldn't like to try it?
No.
Right. Well, Perry, in fact, doesn't drink much normally anyway, but then many people don't. And it's debatable whether even a single drink would leave them completely unaffected. It's because of that uncertainty that in Sweden, at least, the legal limit for drinking and driving is actually 0. You can't drink alcohol at all if you intend to drive. Now, that may seem a bit drastic for the UK, until you consider that among young people, the commonest cause of death in Britain is a road accident, and almost half of those accidents involve a person who's been drinking.
But accidents are perhaps one of the more obvious consequences of drinking, much more difficult to assess are the effects of drinking on people's personal lives. And we've often heard of the misery that it can cause to families like Paul Murphy's here. Now, Paul, tell us what happened to you.
When I was about 10 years of age, my mother left home because of my father's drinking, because of his violence towards her, beating her up, his violence towards us. it all eventually ended up with our whole family splitting up, all our younger brothers all going into homes and all being split up from each other.
Mm. So how did you feel about your dad doing that then?
Well, when we was young, it was very hard because at first he didn't have any pocket money because all the money went on his drink. You tend to feel embarrassed in ways because all your friends knew he drank and everyone knew he was an alcoholic and he went out drinking. But the saddest thing to me was outside of the house, everybody knew Pat Murphy, what a diamond fella he was. You couldn't say anything wrong about Pat Murphy, but believe you me, I could say a few things about him behind closed doors. He was a different man.
Mm. Now, Lorraine, you met Paul's dad before you got married, so in a way you knew what you were walking into. I mean, what were your sort of reactions to that?
Well, I get very worried when Paul goes out drinking. I worry in case he drinks too much and ends up like his father.
Now, I mean, this is quite an embarrassing thing to have to talk about. And what made you decide to come on the show?
Because of the effects that alcohol does to people, I've had personally myself the experience of what alcohol does to families and what it did to my family and to what I tend to see not happen to me and my wife and our family now. Now I've got a young family. That's like what my father is more interested in his alcohol, not in what his children did. I intend to show every interest in what my children did. What my father never did to me and hug me or say how proud he was of me or come and watch me on the sports field, I intend to watch and follow my children's, whatever they do.
Right.
That's how I intend to.
Paul and Lorraine, thanks very much.
Thank you.
The misery that drinking leads to can't, of course, be measured. But there are figures which do at least give us an insight into the scale of the problem. Simply in terms of emergency admissions to hospital each year, some 500,000 of them are linked to alcohol. In terms of fatalities, alcohol is linked to 1/3 of all accidental deaths, whether on or off the roads, and to 1/3 of all suicides. Alcohol is linked to half of all deaths from fire, to half of all road deaths, especially among young people, and to half of all murders. And perhaps most shocking of all, alcohol is implicated in 3/4 of all crimes of violence, whether they're fatal or not.
When alcohol is clearly so damaging, it's a tragedy that we should find it so difficult to either give up or cut down to safer levels. As we've seen, part of the reason is because the inhibitory system that would normally allow us to behave responsibly is itself affected by the alcohol. Government action, such as putting up prices or reducing the availability of alcohol, might help tackle the problem, but there are also things that we can do individually. Now, one way of avoiding being seduced by alcohol is to keep a record like this. What you do is to note down what you drink each day and then add it up to make a weekly total. And the idea is that when you see what you drink, that in itself can encourage you to drink less. Now, to find out if it works, Joan Smith and her two sons, Stephen and Peter, all from Billericay, volunteered to try it. For the first week, they simply recorded what they were drinking each day. And then for the next 2 weeks, we asked them to try and keep within the recommended limits. Now, before you started this experiment, did you think of yourselves as average or heavy drinkers? Average. Okay, well, let's start with the first week. Joan, what was your total?
My total was 33. I had 2 parties that week.
That's your excuse,
I was quite appalled when I counted it up.
Was that more than you expected?
Yes, it was.
And Steve, what about you?
43.5 the first week, which is about twice what I would have estimated.
Yeah, that's also about twice the safe level for men.
That's right.
Any excuses?
No, that's a pretty average week, Aaron.
Right, and Peter, what about you?
Well, I should explain my excuse, as you put it, is that I'm an assistant manager in a nightclub, so I'm very vulnerable. Although my figures show that when I'm actually working, my alcohol level is very low. My nights off, I go out and I enjoy myself, and I totaled 50 for the
50?
first week, yeah, which I was very surprised at.
Way over the safe limit.
Yeah.
Men. Now, what about in the second 2 weeks, when you were trying to keep to the recommended levels? Joan, how did you get on?
Well, on the second week, I booked a holiday, and we took the holiday. And when we booked in a hotel, I saw the holiday advertised through CFAX, and when I booked it, she asked me why I'd picked her hotel, and I told her. And she said, "Oh, that's lovely." She said, "You're entitled to a litre of wine, your husband and yourself, each evening with your meal." So I'm afraid I failed again. But I totaled 25 that week.
Oh dear. Okay, well, it's better. It's still not quite down to the safe limit for women. Stephen, how did you get on?
Well, the second and third weeks, unfortunately, I had a stag night and 2 weddings to go to. So it was pretty bad, but luckily I managed to, although I failed on the first day with 10 units in one day, for the rest of the 2 weeks I did 15 and 20 units.
So that's good. You did get down to
I got down
below
to
the
below
safe
the
level.
limit, yeah.
Now, Peter, it's well known that people who work in pubs and clubs are more likely to have problems with alcohol
Yeah.
abuse. Did you feel under particular pressure to drink when you're at work?
Well, by the second week of the experiment, a lot of people within the nightclub knew about what I was doing, and I got a lot of people saying, no, have a drink, don't worry. But while I was actually working, I found it quite successful, I found it quite easy, but on my night off, I still found it very difficult to actually cut down. So the second week was 27 units, so, which is better
But
still
not
over.
as good as you'd hoped.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've all tried. Do you now think you're going to keep down to recommended levels?
Try. Don't say any more than that.
Possible.
Yeah.
Stephen?
I think it's going to be difficult.
And Peter?
Difficult. I'm going to try.
At least you're honest. Thank you all very much.
Apart from the outside pressures, many people drink because they feel it's going to help them to have a good time. But is it actually necessary? Some psychologists believe that our attitude is just as important as the alcohol. So we decided to put their theory to the test. We asked one of our production team to throw a party for her friends, and we arranged to film it. There were the usual array of party drinks on offer, red and white wine and lashings of lager, and everyone seemed to be having a very good time. And in fact, they're all here in the studio, so let's find out. Can I ask you, what was the party like? Good fun? Great? You all had a good time? Right, well, it may surprise you or not to know that, in fact, having a good time had nothing to do with alcohol, because all the drinks that were served at that party were either very low or completely alcohol-free. In fact, the wine that you were drinking, you'd need to drink about 130 bottles of that to get up to the legal drink drive limit. Well, despite that, everyone had a good time. So it looks as if those psychologists were right. And that should be an encouragement to all of us to keep our drinking within the limits. And to get our audience here off on the right foot, perhaps they'd all like to join us, thank you, in a glass of our low alcohol lager which we served at the party. Meanwhile, your very good health. Good night.
There's a free leaflet available called Sensible Drinking, Here's How, and if you'd like a copy, please send your name and address to Sensible Drinking, P.O. Box 7, London W3 6XJ.